Business is made possible by our partners, Solar Dynamics, the most efficient energy systems.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Business. I'm Wendy Burke. Today we're going to be discussing the disabled community, creating a more inclusive society. Now, while Disability Month may have ended last month, the topic is fresh on the table and always should be. And we're going to be talking about some draft policy as well as the proposed legislation which that policy will help to guide. To help me this evening discuss the topic and break it down are Kerryann Ifill, the President of the Barbados Council for the Disabled, Professor Dwayne Devonish of the UWI, who's a management and organizational behavior specialist and who also had a large role to play in the drafting of that policy. Also with us is Mr. Edmund Hinkson, Member of Parliament, also serving as the Chairman of the Advisory Committee for Improving the Lives of People with Disabilities. I want to welcome all three of you, lady and gents.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, Wendy.
Yes, I also want to welcome you, our viewers. And remember, a little later in our program, you can dial in at 228-5562 and 228-5563. So before we get the discussion going, we'll take a quick commercial break and be right back and get into it. And we're back. I'm going to throw first to Mr. Hinkson as the chair of the committee to look at the whole issue of the policy behind the legislation and the legislation and what prompted the development of the two.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy, and good evening to all Barbadians and especially those listening in to this program. Barbados would have signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2007. That convention would have been drafted and scripted in 2006. In February 2013, on the 27th of February 2013, we then ratified that convention. When we ratified that convention, we had an international obligation to domesticate that convention by passing it into the laws of Barbados. As you will see, of course, over 10 years has passed and we haven't done that yet. So that's the first thing, we have an international obligation to pass that convention in all its form, all its provisions into the laws of Barbados. And that's what we're attempting to do. That's what the Cabinet of Barbados has, in principle, agreed to do. So we now have a draft bill on this issue, and the convention, in fact, is a schedule to the bill. The convention, in fact, speaks towards all aspects of the lives of persons with disabilities and seeks principally to provide for full participation of all persons with disabilities in every aspect of life. In the signatory countries to that convention says that people with disabilities must be included in everything, all aspects of life, must not be excluded, must not be discriminated against in any way, and must be treated equally before the law and otherwise in all aspects of life. And these are fundamental human rights, constitutional rights. Persons with disabilities are not included at present in our constitutional framework, the fundamental rights clauses as to persons who should not be discriminated against, as included are, of course, gender and religion, creed. But there will be a proposal, there has been a proposal to the Law Reform Commission, Constitutional Law Reform Commission, to include persons with disabilities in that fundamental human rights clause. And why so? Because people with disabilities are among the most vulnerable group of people in this country, in this society. They haven't been treated equally in all aspects of life there. And we know this, there's a lot of insensitivity towards people with disability. So therefore, one of the mandates of the National Advisory Committee, whose tenure in fact ended on Friday, the 31st of March, was to increase public awareness on issues relating to people with disabilities. And part of the law, in fact, the bill which we have drafted with the assistance of Dr. Jason Haynes, an academic law lecturer now in England, with the assistance of the Law Reform Commission, which is headed by Sir David Simmons. So our draft bill defines and addresses all aspects of the life of persons with disabilities, education, for example, and we all know that we have had legislation for over 60 years stating that education should be free at the point of delivery for all children between ages 4 and now 16. But practically speaking, education is not free for many children with disabilities because their parents have to pay for them at special schools. Employment. Okay. 90% of adult persons with disabilities in Barbados do not have a job, are not employed, or are not self-employed. And that stems naturally from the disadvantages children with disabilities have in terms of our education. And let's look at health, primary area. People with disabilities have tremendous difficulty in terms of the accessing health care and the cost of some health care.
Okay.
Accessibility is another area, housing. So the legislation speaks to all of these issues. Social protection. As of now, only persons who are blind or who are deaf without hearing, as of right, are entitled to social welfare benefits. So even if you're deaf but with hearing, you're not entitled as of right. So the law, or the draft bill, seeks to close that gap and to avoid discrimination against persons with other disabilities in terms of provision for health, for social protection. Housing, the Cabinet of Barbados already agreed last year, August, that 10% of all state housing or housing built with state assistance would be designed for and allocated to persons with disabilities. And the law enshrines that policy of the Cabinet. So these are areas, some of the areas that the law speaks to, and the necessity for legislation, because it is the right thing to do. It is a serious gap and defect in our legislative framework that we don't have disabilities legislation. 5 of our fellow CARICOM countries have it, and therefore we're looking as a caring government to redress that deficiency. by
Okay.
having the law, hopefully sometime this year.
If I can get Professor Devonish to weigh in here now in terms of the policy also, which would have been guiding things and your role in this process, Professor Devonish.
Thank you, Wendy, and good evening to the viewers. Let me first commend the National Advisory Committee for some fantastic work in getting the inputs of this policy from the various stakeholders. I would also like to commend the ministry. I would also like to commend all persons with disabilities who have contributed to the development of this policy. Mr. Hinkson highlighted the rationale for the policy. It is now important to note that there are two instruments to be passed to Cabinet. This is the draft legislation and the draft policy. Now, with respect to the latter, as you would know, legislation provides the legal requirements. Policy allows for the enabling environment for those legislative requirements to be rolled out successfully. The policy itself rests on a definition that persons with disabilities, that community is not a single or singular community, but it's a diverse community. So the policy addresses the definition of disability, recognizing that oftentimes the lay community places the greater weight on the impairment of the individual, but effectively the extent of the disability rests with the interactions of those people, with the various barriers across various aspects of society, from education, employment, health, the legal and justice system. So there are a number of areas that the policy actually covers. Effectively, the purpose of the policy is to advance, promote, and protect the key fundamental rights and freedoms of all persons with disabilities in Barbados, recognizing that there are visible and invisible disabilities. The policy in and of itself provides an implementation framework for the rollout of these activities across the various dimensions that we've acknowledged that the policies should cover over a 7-year period. So it is a 7-year implementation rollout of this policy.
Okay.
I should say that the policy has accommodated the caregivers of persons who are severely disabled. For example, one activity I can remember is the recommendation of a caregiver support program, because there are a number of caregivers out there in Barbados who are overwhelmed in the care of persons who are severely disabled, especially with little resources, little support. And you can see that that activity is going to roll out with respite care services and support in training. A key thing about this policy is the fact that it places, as Mr. Hinkson highlighted, a greater weight on awareness building. We still have to recognize that the most critical barrier is not necessarily the environmental or structural barrier in the physical accessibility of buildings and roads, but really the attitudinal barrier. So what the policy does is to set out a platform for changing the mindsets, the attitudes, the ground where things like prejudice and discrimination can flourish. The policy refurbishes that environment to ensure that those barriers are identified and addressed. I would like to close by saying, I know that there will be some questions after on the point, but that the policy also does not see persons with disabilities as simple recipients of aid and assistance, but actual agents of change in their lives, livelihoods, and destiny. Thank you, Wendy.
Okay. And I think that is a good point for us here to break off to our commercial break. When we come back, I will speak with Ms. Ifill about the involvement of the disabled community in this entire process and how she feels as a member of that community that some proactive measures are being taken and change is about to come. We'll be right back after the break. And we're back. The topic, the disabled community, creating a more inclusive society. Let's go straight to Kerryann Ifill, head of the BCD, Barbados Council for the Disabled. How do you feel now you've gone through the various processes toward the policy and the legislation? Do you think it is going to happen, what you've been wishing for all these years?
Well, I take challenge with one word, wishing. We've been working on this process for a very long time. And this committee is another cog in the wheel, and we've been a very effective wheel, I must say. One of the things I loved about working with this committee is it was of and for by persons with disabilities. So we had 4 persons who actually have disabilities, but all 8 of us have lived experiences. You had parents, you had teacher parents, you had siblings of persons with disabilities. So from that viewpoint, it definitely resonated well. The policy and the legislation were crafted directly from the words of persons with disabilities. So it's one of the most participatory activities we've had in a very long time. And it really resonates well with all of us. Do I think it's going to come? Yes, I definitely do. Like I said, it's something we've been working towards for a long time. In 2002, when the white paper was first laid in Parliament, when the convention was ratified in 2013, and all of the work that went in between and since then, it's been a lot of work, and this is a culmination of a long time of work by a whole lot of people. The 3 of us sitting here today are merely a microcosm of who have actually put work in on getting to where we are at now. So yes, I'm really excited about where we are and where we're headed.
I recognize in the draft policy and document, legislation, that you are very particular and exacting in terms of the areas covered. Education is broken down, health is broken down, access to legal counsel is broken down. Fines have actually been placed within the proposals in terms of individuals abusing and discriminating against the disabled, whether it be in personal relationships, sexual relationships, or within the world of work. And you're nodding there, Professor Devonish, and I found that to be quite interesting because just like Mr. Hinkson said, the disabled community, more so than a lot of other people, have a number of barriers before them. So I know you would have had a large part in the drafting aspect of it, Professor Devonish, and I just want to hear some more as to what went behind breaking it down in this specific way.
Thank you, Wendy. And let me just first background this by saying that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities carries almost 50 articles. And each article speaks to a fundamental right and freedom of people with disabilities. And what we decided to do is to juxtapose the policy strategies against those articles. So effectively, when you think about rights to education, the articles are very specific on that, and we wanted that specificity to be maintained within the same policy document. So let's give a perfect example. Within the educational component, we've not just catered to the educational system, but even the training system for adult learners with disabilities. So the TVET, technical vocational educational institutions, we didn't just speak to assistive equipment, but also human resource support, those who are trained in sign language, those who are trained in other types of accessible information. We also looked specifically at affordability. So what we wanted to do was that we wanted the granularity to be maintained within the policy document, because there's always a danger of speaking quite generically in a policy document, and then it goes under the table. But once it is clear, it is specific, it is detailed within the policy document, then there's no choice to recognize it and to act on it. Employment, as you just said, is a critical area where we actually did a deep dive. Because if you think about it, employment is just not a person with a disability seeking a job, but also that person who may want to transition to entrepreneurial activity or self-employment. And there are barriers in that segment of livelihood. So we were very specific in that. The other thing that you probably would see within the policy across the board is the need for disability sensitivity and awareness training across the justice system, within the legal system, within the healthcare system. So not just having the equipment, the assistive equipment or the assistive technologies in the healthcare sector, but ensuring that the people who deliver healthcare are doing it in a disability-friendly and sensitive way. That is cut across education, is cut across the workforce. We talked about women and children who are disproportionately at risk of exploitation and violence. Those areas, women and children with disabilities, we actually took that out as a separate area to ensure it has sufficient attention at the policy and legislative level. So it was deliberate for the granularity and the specific details to be rendered within that policy document.
Okay. Perhaps, Mr. Hinkson, in terms of when this stuff is presented, you can give us maybe a few timelines. You said your committee would have wound up at the end of the month. So what are we looking toward from here? What's the next step?
Wendy, the draft national policy document, which Professor Devonish has spoken about, has a 7-year timeline divided into short, medium, and long-term strategies, as well as the draft bill is before the Ministry of People Empowerment, which is the ministry which has the mandate to treat towards disabilities issues. And here I'd like to again publicly thank Minister Humphrey and his ministerial staff for the tremendous cooperation that they given to the National Advisory Committee over the last 10 months. And Minister Humphrey has, in fact, up to last Wednesday night at the inaugural Special Ambassador's address, which was delivered by Ms. Janelle Odell, attorney at law, who is a member of the National Advisory Committee. Minister Humphrey promised the public that he will have a cabinet paper before the cabinet this month on the issues. And of course, it would be in cabinet's hand to approve, consider and approve the policy and the legislation. And from there, of course, once approved, the legislation will go to the Chief Parliamentary Council for review to make sure that it is in conformity with other legislations and written in presentable style to go to the Parliament of Barbados for debate. So, as I said earlier, hopefully all of this will happen during the course of this year because it is long overdue.
Okay, and that is a position which Ms. Ifill had agreed with earlier. No, he spoke to, I think it was Professor Devonish, the issue of invisible disabilities. Perhaps, Ms. Ifill, you can help the viewers to understand what those actually are, because you know a blind person is blind. You can tell some person is hearing impaired, deaf, because you have to be signed to, etc. But what are some of the other disabilities that are present, but we, the general population, might not be quite aware of?
It is recognized as World Autism Day, and autism is one of those disabilities which you don't look at a person and determine that they have a disability. And that is one of the places to start. Autism is a spectrum, as we know, and it can present itself in a variety of different behaviors and different manifestations and what's not. Then, of course, there are the other disabilities. When we say hidden, it's not really that they're hidden. It's more a case of they're not physically recognized. So some disorders, multiple sclerosis, and some of the other, myasthenia gravis and some of the others like that, they begin in such a way that you don't know. So the person may have a challenge walking long distances, standing in lines, that kind of thing, and therefore they may need some accommodations. But when they look at you, people don't think you have a disability. And there are others. You have the learning disabilities. Dyslexia is not something that you can't look at someone and determine. And there are other emotional challenges and what's not that manifest. Mental illness is one of the 5 classified areas of disability. And so persons under the psychosocial disorders are also classified as having a disability. Then, of course, you have persons with the NCDs and what's not, which lead to disability. So again, all of those can fall into that category.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification. Now, also in this legislation, this policy, I looked and realized that there's a fine for individuals who may be trying to trick the system into thinking that they are disabled in order to be given access to some of the benefits which will augur toward the disabled community. Mr. Hinkson, Ms. Ifill was saying before, all of you have been touched in some way by it. Have you ever come across that type of thing? Somebody trying to pretend that they are disabled in order to get access to welfare or to these special parking stickers, what have you?
I would answer that question this way, Wendy, that we have protections within the bill that would not happen, because your disability would have to be certified by medical doctor. We know, for instance, that on application for registration of the Trident card, there is provision for persons with disabilities to state their disability within that, and we're encouraging people to go and not only get your Trident card, but to register your disability, because there will be benefits accruing to you to be registered as a person with disability. You spoke about the issue of being able to park in a disabilities reserved car park, and this is an area that we have to address, because there are instances every day where people who are not entitled because of their physical position or mental position, but do park in car park spaces reserved for persons with disabilities, and we urge people not to do this. Quite honestly, it is a selfish, uncaring act. So we have provision, to which will certainly make it difficult to beat the system, as we Bajans will call it.
Okay, now part of the policy is to help sensitize the Barbadian public a lot more, so that the whole idea of inclusion is true and genuine. How have you found, Ms. Ifill, not only during this month, but since the committee was set up and persons could come forward and give the information, do you find that family members, friends, etc., were helped a lot more by being able to attend those sessions with those individuals who are disabled to learn more about what's being faced across the community?
In all areas is necessary, and yes, persons with disabilities have definitely benefited from opportunities to share. We had persons from the deaf community speaking about persons saying, coming and trying to speak to them during the vaccination process during the pandemic, and becoming irate and upset because they, as we say, quote unquote, look normal. And they were told you couldn't come in here because you didn't look like you had a disability. So definitely sensitivity training and awareness raising has helped But it's not where it needs to be. We run into too many persons who still think that disability means, I don't like to use the catchphrases, that people with disabilities just plain can't, whatever it is, they want to do that you're just not supposed to do, that you must be put in your place, and that's not I challenge people all the time. Remember, persons with disabilities are simply that. Persons, people, individuals. We have the same rights, needs, desires, abilities. We fall prey to the same illnesses, the same diseases, the same bad habits, the same good habits. When Rihanna took the stage at the football, I am not a football fan, Super Bowl, right? When she took the stage at Super Bowl, persons with disabilities were cheering her on just like every other Barbadian, right? Because those things touch all of us. And it's only when the topic of disability come up that people start segregating. So definitely having people out to the town hall meetings to hear and to learn. The parents that shared about bullying, about one parent shared at one of our town hall meetings that his child had to change 9 schools because of the bullying that he was experiencing in some of those places. And other people were like, well, me too, these things happen. So it was important for people to be able to share, to understand that, one, they're not alone. They're not the only people that have gone through this. It's not unique to you, to your child, to your brother, to your sister, to whatever. And it was also important to learn that together we can strengthen. And that's why this legislation and policy is so important, because it has grown out of those discussions. It is reacting to what people said they were experiencing. So hence people might say, oh, there are more fines coming. But they had to come because sometimes people don't listen.
That is so very true. When we come back, we'll deep dive some more into some of the specific areas of the policy and legislation. We'll take a quick commercial break. Just remember, our call numbers are 228-5562, 228-5563. Now, there's one area of the legislation that interests me particularly, because I know of individuals who are disabled, and it has been one of the issues they've had to deal with, but there wasn't much help necessarily. And that's this whole issue of abuse for females within the disabled community, and the issue of access and consensual sex. Perhaps you can take this one, Mr. Hinkson, as you are an attorney as well. But there are some people who are of the belief that if you are disabled, it means you're without desire. And then there are other people who believe that because you have a particular disability and I can overpower you physically, then it's my right to take it, or to try to coerce you because mentally you may not be where I am, and I will try to convince you that what I want to do to you is right.
Well, let's put this in perspective. The 2010 census indicated that about 5% of all Barbadians have some form of disability. That was most likely an understatement, because not everyone wishes to define their disability and say that they are. But certainly over the last 13 years, and of course, as we all know, we're awaiting the results of the latest census, but certainly over the last 13 years, that percentage will be higher because, one, people are living longer, and we know that there's a growing amount of people with Alzheimer's and dementia. The longer they live, visual impairment, deafness as well. We've had chikungunya, COVID, which regrettably have left a lot of people who survived those two pandemics, one much worse than the other, with some form of disability. So that's the perspective we're looking at. And then, of course, each person with disability, if you account for one caregiver, at least for them, that is what, 15% of the population in all that is affected in some way by disabilities. Look, the whole basis is that people with disabilities are individuals, human beings with rights, just like everyone else. And therefore, yes, the draft legislation speaks towards abuse, sexual, and otherwise physical, against persons with disabilities, and penalizes it because it is not acceptable. And it is even more so not acceptable because, as we have said, people with disabilities are among the most vulnerable, financially, emotionally, physically, mentally, among the people of our country. And the state has a duty to intervene legislatively to protect the most vulnerable in our society. But I'll let Kerry speak towards, the lived examples of abuse of persons with disabilities.
Unfortunately, abuse of persons with disabilities is a reality. During the pandemic, the Council for the Disabled, we partnered with the UNFPA, an agency we've worked with for many years, to bring awareness to domestic violence against persons with disabilities. You have a person with a disability in the home. A lot of people didn't, before the pandemic, we didn't know our families as well as we do now. And one of the unfortunate side effects of being in confined spaces was tempers were raising, and a lot of persons with disabilities were victims of domestic abuse. But not only in that environment. Sexual abuse, as you rightly highlighted, Wendy, has been a long-standing, because there are people out there who think it's their God-given right to introduce the poor disabled person to this wonderful world that they won't otherwise get to experience, because nobody would want to touch them, catch disability, but we'll help them out. That's the attitude some people have. One form of abuse that I don't think we talk about enough is also the psychological and the emotional abuse that a lot of persons with disabilities have to endure. And that is being told you're nothing, you're worth nothing. Even the subtle ones that say, no, I'll do this for you because you will never be able to do this for yourself. That is abuse as well, and a lot of people don't realize that. And then, of course, there's the economic and financial abuse, where persons hold on to your benefits and they see you as a cash cow because, your disability is really an impediment to this household. We don't have enough money here because of you. You big hardback man can't go out there and work. So I have the right to take your welfare and your other benefits because, you don't know how to spend the money. You never learn how to do this, so I got to do it for you. And that is financial and economic abuse. And all of those things have been ongoing. The legislation and the policy speak to implementing a commission that will oversee rights, the discussions on the rights and the applications of the fines, and the legislation speaks to that because these things have been going on in our country. A lot of us shut our eyes to it and don't think it's necessary to discuss. But it's not because, it's normal, it's not normal. People are people. Whether you have the intellectual capacity of an Einstein or you are limited because of whatever challenge you may be experiencing, whatever life is, if you're in a wheelchair, if you are mobility impaired, blind, deaf, whatever, nobody has the right to take advantage.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised the intellectual element because there's a particular school, and being in the Bridgetown area before with work, I would see individuals targeting the girls from this particular school or encouraging the boys to, show them things. And there were even videos where on social media that people put up of various sex acts being committed against these individuals without their consent. One, because they're underage, and two, they really weren't sure of what they were being lured into. And I believe it has come to a time where we all as citizens need to discourage these things, because something that we tend to do far too often is to make disabled people the brunt of a joke.
Yes.
You know, and it needs to be cut out.
Yeah.
Definitely, Wendy.
Go ahead, Professor Devonish.
Yeah. No, I was making a point, just piggybacking from your last statement. That is why this is not simply a state-led effort. It has to be a whole of country approach. The notion of the policy is that it pulls together from not just law enforcement, those in these various state agencies, but even the communities. There's a large articulation of having a community awareness building program across at-risk communities in which persons with disabilities reside. In fact, we're also looking at setting up community surveillance systems, similar to what we've proposed for the national policy for aging, to protect persons who are aging from elder abuse. We want those same systems to be operational to protect persons with disabilities in those communities. So it really rests on the agency of a community member or neighbor to report wrongdoing, or to allow for that investigation to take place and for justice to be served.
I'm so glad you raised that particular element, because for years I have seen situations whereby individuals, because their children were disabled, did not even bother to output the effort to get them into a school. So they go from childhood to adolescence to adulthood being unable to do much, to understand how to cope. But you don't know if they would have gotten to that place because they've never been exposed to any of those elements that would have helped them within the coping. Because if education is not what they can fast track to, like say Kerryann and Janelle, in terms of being able to go to a school which accommodated them because of their disabilities and did not see that as being their disability as being an impediment to their cognitive access and skills, etc., because there's nothing saying disabled people don't learn. It's all about what the disability is. But again, we just on the surface look, make an assumption, and relegate people to a different place and space because they're disabled. So I'm glad that there's going to be that lookout so that we can ensure that no child is left behind. If no child must be left behind in our regular society, then it should be triple that for the disabled, because there are already so many hurdles they have to cross.
That's definitely correct, Wendy. And that's why the bill also speaks to affirmative action principles. In other words, that giving a person with disability an opportunity, a chance that they deserve. And that is based on merit. As Kerryann said, it is not tokenism here. It is giving people with disabilities the opportunity. Cannot be seen, would not be seen under the legislation as a disadvantage to a person who does not have a disability. And this is a key area which has to be done to address the imbalances and the disadvantages that persons with disabilities experience traditionally in Barbados. We know that affirmative action principles have been used in, for example, the United States of America over the last, 55 odd years to give minority races, specifically the black people, an opportunity to emerge and to create, a middle income group and to improve socially. And this principle is a key principle in this legislation because, as I said, if you have 90% of a category of persons who are not employed. In other words, 10 times the average unemployment rate of people in Barbados is what people with disabilities are experiencing, not because they don't have the ability, but because they don't have the opportunity. Because potential employers, for example, a lot of them traditionally, when they see you have a disability, you might be in a wheelchair, but that doesn't mean that your brain is not better than most people who don't have a disability. They then don't give you an opportunity, and therefore that has to be addressed. So therefore, within the legislation, for example, is the proposal that 5% of all government jobs will go to people with disabilities. That is nothing unusual. Jamaica has had that policy even before it had legislation, 4%, and now they have legislation which came into effect last year. It's now 5%. That within the private sector, there are quotas, depending on how many people you employ in your business, for persons with disabilities to be employed.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we'll talk a bit more about the disabled and access to employment, because some of the jobs are very traditional or lower, at the lower base, and that does not have to be. We'll be back in a bit.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kia Lewis, General Practitioner and Healthy Lifestyle Advocate. Good nutrition starts at home. So this school year, I want you to consider packing healthy, nutritious snacks and lunches for your children to carry, rather than having them buy them at school. And don't just pack things you think they should have. Have a discussion and come up with things that you both know they will enjoy.
And we're back. Now, during the break, one of our Facebook viewers wanted to find out from the panel if a person is currently now receiving a disability check, whether or not they will be eligible for pension when they reach pension age. Rosalind is her name. Yeah.
It depends on when they say disability check, there's a welfare check for some categories of disabilities, and then there is a non-contributory pension, which Mr. Hinkson spoke of earlier, that goes to blind or persons who are deaf or without speech. Now, those pensions start when you're 18, the one for the deaf and the blind, and that doesn't stop because it's non-contributory. Well, there are some caveats, which I will come back to. The welfare checks, well, when you reach the pensionable age, you're entitled to pension, I believe, right, Eddie? Yes, you're entitled to your pension. If you can receive benefits if you became disabled on the job, if you were paying contributions and you became disabled, you get your NIS benefits like anybody else. Where the difficulties start to come, however, are the provisions. For example, if you earn more than $30 a week, you are no longer entitled to receive the non-contributory pension. Welfare benefits stop if it is determined that you have another source of support adequate. So there are those challenges, because I used to joke, but I don't joke anymore, that disability is a habit I can't afford. It is very expensive to live with a disability, no matter what nationality or what country you're in. There are associated difficulties and financial considerations, right? It's not, so there is that. But yes, you are into the short answer to the question is yes. If you receive benefits when you reach the pensionable age, like any other Barbadian citizen, you are entitled to your pension.
Okay, we have a caller on the line. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Wendy, to you on the panel.
Good evening to you.
At least there is a hint that they're going to do something about the disability. So that way people will say, hey, sir, after they call in, when I hear about the national disability, I am...
Are you there?
The fall, and I haven't been able to write by doing through my head, and I have written a 8-line poem, a plea to the national disability, and it goes like this. I want to send out an SOS or cable to the...
Okay, it seems as though that
we have the Honourable Minister Kirk. I hope he's not there only to talk the pretty...
Okay, the caller is dropping in and out on the line. I'm not sure what difficulty he's having, but he was penning a poem, I believe, in support of the disabled community. Too bad we didn't get to hear all of it. Now, we have a couple more minutes left, and I wanted to look at the issue of the employment. Now, the figures staggering, but do you think that with how the schools are set up now, whether it be special needs schools or if the disabled are integrated into regular schools, that we are indeed preparing the disabled for the world of work? I'll put this one to you, Ms. Ifill.
Well, let's start, as you said, with education. Special needs schools, they do have most of them, if not all. And I say most only because I haven't visited every special needs school. But generally speaking, they have independent living training at most schools, and they have other programs, and they do speak about preparing persons to the world of work. I've been a consultant with the National Disabilities Unit for a number of years, an agency of government that has worked and it continues to work very assiduously on behalf of persons with disabilities. And within my program, I run a career guidance program for persons who are blind and visually impaired specifically. The National Disabilities Unit they have their own programs going as well that address the area. But work and employment are big issues for us because, as you were saying before we went to break, Wendy, too many people with disabilities, you know, people feel good to say, yes, I have a person with a disability, but there are very little chances for growth, chances for development, advancement in the workplace. It's as though we've got our token disabled persons, so we don't need them to go any further. We don't expect more of them, so we don't demand more of them, and we don't hold them to the same accountability standards. A large part of that comes to sensitivity training and disability awareness. People need to be more aware. Some people don't know how to communicate effectively. I had a call with someone last year about a person with a disability who works in their entity, in their organization. And they said, but we can't get across to the individual. We can't seem to get them to understand how to accomplish this task. It's because they weren't speaking to them in the right way. I'm not talking about any fancy language or anything like that, but there's more communication that they needed training in. And all of that comes as part of the need when you talk about employment. Employment is also, and entrepreneurship is a big issue for us among the disabled community as well, because yeah, it's necessary.
All right. Now we are at the final moments. If I can have the parting shots from... Okay, it's time for us to go. No parting shots here, but let's hope that the issue of inclusion has been made quite lucid in the minds of those viewers tonight. And I'm sure that they can reach out to you, Kerry, at the Council for the Disabled, as well as you, Mr. Hinkson, for any information that would be needed going forward. So I want to thank you, all three of you panelists this evening, lady and gents, for joining me on the topic, the disabled community, creating a more inclusive society. And I'm ready to see that legislation put into place. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Wendy, for having us.
Yes, and to our viewers, do have a good night.